Life can take everything from a man in the blink of an eye. For years, his home was filled with laughter, the voices of children running through the hallway, and the warm smile of his wife who kept their family together. But then tragedy struck. First came the accident that took his wife away. Just when he thought he could barely stand on his own, sickness came for his children. Within months, his house, once alive, turned into nothing but an echo chamber of silence and grief. There are moments after loss when the human heart feels it cannot go on, when waking up feels like a punishment and surviving another day feels like betrayal to those who are gone. And yet, through this storm of grief, one small light remained, his dog. A loyal companion, a faithful soul who had been with him even before the tragedies. The dog had curled at the feet of his wife, had chased the giggles of his children in the backyard, and had stayed by the man's side through endless nights of sobbing into his hands. This dog became more than a pet. He became a lifeline. The only breathing reminder that love still existed in this world. Feeding him gave the man a reason to leave his bed. Walking him gave him a reason to step outside when the walls of the house threatened to crush him. Stroking his fur reminded him of the warmth of family. In that wagging tail, in those trusting eyes, the man found the will to survive. But not everyone understood this bond. To the outside world, especially people like Karen, a dog was just an animal, a noisy nuisance, something that disrupted their perfect order of life. She lived across the street, her house surrounded by trimmed hedges and strict rules. She had appointed herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, policing every lawn, every sound, every small action that she deemed unfit. She never asked, never cared for stories behind closed doors. For her, control was everything. The man tried to stay invisible. He didn't have the strength to argue or fight. His world was reduced to him and his dog, and that was all he wanted to hold on to. But Karen noticed every little thing. She noticed the barking when delivery men passed by. She noticed the paw prints in the front yard. She noticed the way the dog would stand near her property line, tail wagging, harmless, but too close for her comfort. At first, it was just looks. Cold glares across the street. The tightening of her lips whenever the man walked his dog past her driveway. Then came the muttering, words tossed loud enough to sting but not loud enough to confront. Words like useless and lazy and control your mutt. The man heard them all, but he tried to bury them, because what else could he do? The last thing he wanted was conflict. Yet, the world has a way of colliding the broken with the cruel. One morning, the dog barked loudly in front of Karen's house. It wasn't unusual. A mailman had passed, and dogs bark, that's what they do. But for Karen, it was the final straw. She didn't see a grieving man holding on to the last thread of family. She saw only disobedience, noise, disruption of her carefully controlled life. And in that moment, her anger crossed into something darker. The man, still inside, never imagined the horror that was about to unfold. He heard the barking grow sharper, more desperate. He heard Karen's voice shouting outside, sharp as knives. And then he heard a sound that split the morning air in two, a sound that seemed to stop his heart in its tracks. A gunshot. The world slowed. Silence fell heavy, except for one faint whimper. He ran outside, fear gripping his chest tighter than ever before. And there, on the grass, lay his dog, his companion, his last family, his reason to keep living. Karen stood a few feet away, holding the weapon, her face twisted not with regret but with self-righteous fury, as though she had done something justified. The man dropped to his knees. He didn't need words to understand. His entire world, the last fragile piece of it, had just been torn away. He touched the soft fur one last time, his hands shaking, his vision blurred with tears. The dog's breathing grew weaker, fading like the final notes of a song that should never have ended. And in that terrible, unbearable moment, the man realized that Karen hadn't just shot a dog. She had shot the last reason he had to live. But Karen didn't care. She started shouting, pointing, claiming she had the right, that the dog was a threat, that she had warned him before. Her words cut through the air like poison, but they didn't reach him. He was somewhere else now, a place of grief so deep it didn't need language. The neighbors started peeking through curtains, whispers spreading, but no one came forward. No one stopped her. No one stood with him. He was alone again, just as he had been since the day tragedy took his family away. As he cradled the still body of his beloved companion, something inside him shifted. Pain turned to anger, grief turned to fire. Karen thought she had silenced noise. She thought she had removed a problem. What she had really done was awaken something that had been buried under grief for too long, the will to fight back. The chapter closed not with healing, not with peace, but with the raw wound of loss and the burning spark of revenge beginning to form in his heart. Because when you take everything from a man who already has nothing, what's left inside him is something dangerous, something unyielding. And Karen was about to learn that this wasn't just about a dog. It was about the last piece of his life she had destroyed. The morning after Karen pulled the trigger, the neighborhood was different. Not because anyone showed sympathy, not because justice had come, but because silence had spread like a disease. No one spoke to him. No one looked him in the eye. Curtains remained drawn, doors stayed closed, and the world seemed to conspire to erase what had happened. Yet for the man, erasure was impossible. Every breath he took reminded him of the empty space beside him, the absence of the soft pause that once followed him room to room. The house was now colder than ever. Every corner echoed with memories. The dog's bowl sat untouched in the kitchen. The leash hung by the door, swaying gently each time he passed. The bed where the dog had slept, curled tightly against him on long nights of grief, was now vacant. These weren't just objects. They were cruel reminders of a bond severed by hatred and arrogance. For Karen, life went on as though nothing had happened. She walked through the neighborhood with the same stiff shoulders, the same judgmental glare. She spoke loudly on her phone, made her presence known, and carried herself like she had cleansed the street of some great menace. To her, the dog was just an animal, a noisy inconvenience. To her, the man's grief was irrelevant, his loss insignificant. But deep inside, the man was unraveling. He didn't scream. He didn't cry in public. He didn't knock on Karen's door demanding answers. His silence wasn't weakness, it was the quiet before the storm. Because as each hour passed, as each moment dragged without the sound of paws against the floor, his pain transformed. It hardened into something sharper. He replayed the events in his mind, over and over, until they blurred together into one horrific image: Karen with the gun, Karen with her cold expression, Karen claiming she had been right. That image etched itself into his soul. And with it came a vow he hadn't spoken aloud but felt with every fiber of his being: Karen would not get away with this. The neighbors whispered, but they never intervened. Some said he should have kept the dog quieter. Some muttered that Karen had gone too far, but not one of them stood beside him. Isolation pressed in on him, heavier than ever. And yet, beneath that isolation burned determination. He began to take walks alone, retracing the same paths he had once walked with his companion. The leash dangled empty in his hand, a painful symbol of what he had lost. People watched him from their windows, their eyes full of pity, or perhaps fear, but no one spoke. And every step he took, past Karen's house, past her manicured lawn and spotless hedges, fueled the fire inside him. Karen, emboldened by the silence of the neighborhood, started to push further. She told anyone who would listen that she had saved them all from a dangerous animal. She complained loudly about barking she no longer had to hear, about how peaceful the mornings had become. She carried herself like a hero, blind to the devastation she had caused. The man noticed everything. The way she smirked when their eyes met across the street. The way she exaggerated her stories, turning his loyal friend into a villain. The way she acted as though she had done the community a favor. Every word she spread was salt on his wounds. At night, the house felt unbearable. He sat in the living room surrounded by silence, clutching the dog's collar, the last physical piece of him he could hold. The weight of it in his hand was heavy, but it wasn't enough. Memories flooded him, of walks in the park, of his children hugging the dog tightly, of the way the dog had licked away his tears on nights when despair almost consumed him. Now, those memories turned into fuel. They weren't just moments of love, they were reasons to fight. Because Karen had taken more than a dog. She had taken away the one thing keeping him anchored to life. And that kind of theft couldn't be forgiven. Days turned into weeks, but the grief didn't fade. Instead, it sharpened, becoming a blade he carried silently within himself. He started keeping notes, not of random thoughts, but of Karen's actions, when she left her house, who she spoke to, how she moved through the neighborhood as though she owned it. It wasn't obsession. It was focus. Because deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. Karen thought the matter was settled, that her word would stand, that no one would challenge her. But she didn't understand what it meant to strip a man of everything. She didn't understand that by destroying his last bond, she had left him with nothing to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man of all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the street, the man stood by his window, staring out at Karen's house. He didn't see the paint or the flowers in her yard. He saw the weapon in her hands, the arrogance on her face, the moment his dog's body hit the ground. That vision haunted him relentlessly, and with each haunting came the same thought, this couldn't end here. And so, quietly, without fanfare, he began to prepare. The second chapter of his story was no longer about loss. It was about what comes after loss. About the transformation of grief into resolve. About the beginning of a storm that no one in the neighborhood, not even Karen, could see coming. As night settled and the house grew dark, he clutched the collar in his hand one last time, his jaw set, his heart hardened. He wasn't just mourning anymore. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment to show Karen that what she thought was just a dog was, in truth, his entire life, and that taking it from him had consequences she couldn't imagine. Grief can consume a man until he becomes nothing but a shadow of who he once was. But grief mixed with anger transforms into something more dangerous, a force that refuses to remain silent. That was where the man now found himself. His tears had dried, though his heart still ached. His loneliness was still heavy, though he had grown used to the silence. Yet beneath it all, his focus had sharpened like a blade. The neighborhood moved on quickly, as neighborhoods often do. New families shifted in, children played in the street, and lawnmowers hummed on weekends. To anyone else, the shooting of his dog was already an old story, a forgotten whisper in a community that didn't like conflict lingering for too long. But for him, time had not dulled the wound. Every morning when he opened his eyes to silence, every night when he lay in bed without the familiar weight curled at his side, the wound bled fresh again. And every time he saw Karen, smug, unbothered, moving through life as if she had done the right thing, the fire inside him grew. He had begun to observe her closely, not with paranoia, but with precision. He noticed the patterns of her life. The way she left her house at the same hour each morning, clutching her phone like it was part of her hand. The way she spoke too loudly in the grocery store, complaining about neighbors who didn't know how to live properly. The way she treated the world as if it were hers to control. To the man, she wasn't just Karen anymore. She was the embodiment of everything cruel and careless in the world, people who destroyed what they didn't understand, people who believed authority gave them the right to trample on others' lives. It would have been easy to explode, to scream at her across the street, to demand justice. But he knew better. Karen thrived on confrontation. She wanted noise, arguments, chances to play the victim. That was her strength. His strength would come from patience. Inside his home, he kept reminders of his dog close. The collar on his nightstand, the leash by the door, the photo frames where his children hugged the dog like a sibling. These weren't just mementos anymore. They were promises. Silent vows that what had been done would not be forgotten, and it would not go unanswered. But as he plotted quietly, Karen grew bolder. Perhaps she mistook his silence for defeat. Perhaps she believed that by destroying the last piece of his family, she had broken him completely. She started boasting more openly, telling neighbors how she had saved the block from a noisy animal. She laughed louder, mocked more freely, and strutted past his house as if daring him to respond. Every time she did, the man's jaw tightened. Every time she smirked, his hands clenched. But he held it all in. Because rage without direction was useless. What he needed was precision. What he needed was the right moment. Nights became his sanctuary. While the neighborhood slept, he walked the empty streets, reliving the life he had lost. He could almost hear his children's laughter in the wind, almost feel his wife's gentle hand, almost see the dog running ahead of him, turning back with eyes full of loyalty. These memories hurt, but they also guided him. They reminded him of who he had been, of what he had once loved, and of what had been stolen from him. It was during one of these nights that clarity struck. Karen thought she had silenced him forever. But what she had really done was give him purpose. She had stripped him of everything, his wife, his children, his companion, and in doing so, she had unknowingly created someone with nothing left to lose. And someone with nothing left to lose is unstoppable. The shift inside him was subtle, but undeniable. His grief was no longer paralyzing. It was driving him forward. His pain was no longer a burden. It was fuel. The emptiness inside him was no longer weakness. It was space to build something new, something that could shake Karen's false sense of control to its very core. And so, the man began to prepare, not with grand gestures, but with quiet steps. He started keeping records of every insult, every boast Karen made. He documented her hypocrisy, her violations of the very rules she imposed on others. He noted the way she bent the truth to paint herself as righteous. Piece by piece, he was building a story, not of his grief, but of her corruption. The irony was sharp. Karen believed she was untouchable because she had convinced herself she was the neighborhood savior. But her arrogance blinded her to the cracks in her own image. And the man, patient and precise, was ready to use those cracks. Weeks passed, and while Karen thrived in her self-made role as enforcer of the community, the man thrived in silence. He didn't speak to anyone, but he watched everyone. He didn't make noise, but he noticed every detail. And with each detail, his plan took shape. Karen had stolen the only thing that gave his life meaning. She thought it would leave him broken. Instead, it gave him purpose. And though she didn't know it yet, her downfall had already begun, not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a man who had been broken once and refused to be broken again. As another night settled in, he sat by his window, staring across the street. Karen's house stood lit, her silhouette moving inside like a queen ruling over her tiny kingdom. But in the man's mind, that kingdom was already crumbling. It was only a matter of time. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with the chilling calm of preparation. The man had found his strength, and he was ready to use it. What Karen thought was silence was actually the storm gathering around her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The days that followed became a quiet battleground. On the surface, the neighborhood looked ordinary. Lawns trimmed, cars washed, sprinklers spraying in rhythmic arcs. But beneath the surface, tension was building. The man carried it in his eyes, in the stillness of his movements, in the deliberate way he watched. And though Karen continued her routines as if nothing had changed, cracks were beginning to show in her carefully constructed facade. The man had begun to collect proof. He noted every time Karen broke the same rules she screamed at others for. He saw her leave trash cans out too long, watched her dog-walking friends let pets off-leash in restricted areas, caught her parking where she shouldn't. He photographed, he wrote down, he built a quiet arsenal. Not because he believed the system would deliver justice, but because truth, once revealed, had the power to dismantle lies. Karen had no idea. To her, the silence across the street meant victory. She strutted past his house with satisfaction, her voice loud as ever on phone calls, her laughter exaggerated, her tone dripping with self-importance. She told neighbors how she had saved them, how she had taken action when no one else would. She painted herself as the heroine of the block. But heroes don't destroy what others hold dear. Heroes don't fire weapons at innocents. And the man knew the day would come when her story would collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. At night, the man still felt the sting of loneliness. The house still echoed with silence, and the collar on his nightstand still cut him like glass each time his eyes landed on it. Yet, his grief no longer consumed him. It sharpened him. It reminded him of why he could not stay silent. It told him that every step he took toward exposing Karen was not just about revenge, it was about honoring what he had lost. For the first time in months, his pain had direction. One afternoon, as Karen argued with a delivery driver in her driveway, the man stood at his window, recording quietly. She raised her voice, insulted him, and threatened to report him for being too slow. The driver, tired and humiliated, simply drove away. But the man had caught every second on camera. Another day, Karen scolded children for riding their bikes too close to her yard. Her words were sharp, her tone laced with cruelty. The kids left in tears, and she stood there satisfied. The man took note. He had learned something powerful: Karen didn't just destroy lives by accident. She thrived on control, on making others small. She was not just a villain in his story, she was a villain in many stories. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that showed Karen for who she truly was. And with each piece of evidence, the man's plan grew stronger. The dark, remembering the way his dog used to sit beside him in that very spot. The memories were almost unbearable. But each one fueled him further. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for the family he had lost, for the children who once hugged the dog like a brother, for the wife who had trusted him to keep their home safe. He was doing it because some wrongs should never be buried. Karen, meanwhile, remained blind. She mistook his silence for surrender, his calmness for defeat. She had no idea that every arrogant step she took was being measured, every careless action documented, every lie prepared to be unraveled. But there was something deeper growing inside the man, something even Karen couldn't imagine. It wasn't only about collecting evidence or exposing her hypocrisy. It was about reclaiming his life. For too long, he had been crushed under grief. For too long, he had lived as though survival was his only purpose. Now, he felt a flicker of something different, strength, the kind born from enduring unimaginable pain and still standing. The man began to rebuild himself, piece by piece. He cleaned the house more, not to erase memories, but to honor them. He planted flowers in the yard where his dog once played, not to cover the soil of loss, but to let life bloom again where death had left scars. Neighbors started noticing subtle changes. He looked more focused, more present. He wasn't broken anymore. He was preparing. Karen noticed too, but in her arrogance, she misread it. She believed he was finally moving on, accepting her twisted sense of justice. She didn't realize that what she saw in him wasn't surrender, it was the calm before the storm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood settled into quiet, the man sat at his desk, reviewing everything he had gathered. The notes, the recordings, the photographs, all the pieces of Karen's hypocrisy laid out before him. He stared at them, his mind clear, his heart steady. For the first time since that tragic day, he felt something close to peace. Not because his pain was gone, but because he knew the path forward. Karen thought the story had ended with a gunshot. She thought she had silenced a dog, silenced grief, silenced a man. But in reality, she had written the opening chapter of a story far bigger than she could ever imagine. The man closed his notebook and looked out the window. Across the street, Karen's lights burned bright, her silhouette moving inside. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that the silence she celebrated was not surrender, it was preparation. Because grief had not destroyed him. It had rebuilt him. And soon, the woman who thought it was just a dog would finally understand what she had truly taken, and what it had cost her. The chapter ended with a steady, haunting calm. The kind of calm that signals not the end of pain, but the beginning of consequences.